October 21st, 1891. The fields north of Mayville, North Dakota. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Engineer M.N. Ernsberger stood with one hand resting on the machine, waiting. The boiler held full pressure. 10 loaded wagons stood in line. The crew stood idle. The season was closing. The harvest was behind, and everyone looked on with tightening nerves. Foreman Alan Marsh walked over to him. "The water level is too low," Ernsberger said. "I'm waiting for the water wagon. Starting it now is dangerous." Marsh said something to him. One sentence. That's what made it into the historical record. Ernsberger started the engine. What makes a man who knows the danger go ahead and start it anyway? Hold that question. The answer doesn't live in the boiler. The worst threshing disaster in North Dakota history began at that moment. While researching this story, one question stayed with me. The engine had been overhauled at the start of that season. New flues had been installed. The inspection had been passed. The rule was simple. Everyone knew it, and Ernsberger absolutely knew it. So why did he start the engine? To understand the answer, you have to go back 16 years. 1873. One of the largest private financial institutions in America collapsed. Jay Cooke and Company went bankrupt. There were thousands of creditors, among them a trio of brothers from Pennsylvania: John Livingston Grandin, William James Grandin, Elijah Bishop Grandin. These 3 brothers from Tidiote had grown up in their family's oil business. The family had drilled the second oil well in Pennsylvania. Banking, lumber, industry, they were in all of it. And now Cooke's debt had come out of their pocket. One offer came to the table, a bond exchange for government lands along the Northern Pacific Railroad. The land was thousands of acres of unworked North Dakota soil along an unfinished railroad. On paper, it was worthless. If you want more stories like this one, the kind that don't make it into any textbook, subscribe. There's a lot more coming. J.L. Grandin went out there in 1875. To mark the boundaries, he had no map, no survey equipment, just a compass and a handkerchief tied to the spoke of a buggy wheel. He counted the rotations and measured 19,800 acres that way. But he was an observant man. He studied the topsoil, the clay subsoil beneath it. An idea formed. Wheat would grow here, a great deal of it. They purchased 26,000 acres first, then more still. At its peak, the Grandin Farm exceeded 75,535 acres, not a single field, but its own world, with its own town, its own steamboats, its own grain elevator system. The vast land was divided by number: farm number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Each division had its own foreman, its own crew, its own schedule. The Grandin brothers ran it all from Pennsylvania. They never had to set foot on the land. A manager named Oliver Dalrymple ran the entire operation. During threshing season, between 400 and 800 men were hired. They rose at 5 in the morning and worked 13-hour shifts. The pay was low. The pressure was high. When the season ended, these men disappeared until the next year. The Grandin Empire was built on their labor, and it kept very few records of their names. 1891 was a good harvest year, but it was good news only in the way it appeared to be. The wheat was abundant, the straw even more so. Too much straw meant the threshing machines had to run far longer than usual. Mid-October had arrived, and farm number 4 still had unfinished work. Mid-October in North Dakota meant one thing: snow was coming. Every hour left in the field was a potential loss. That was the weight Alan Marsh carried into that day. That day, things had already been going wrong since early morning. The belts tangled in the pulleys. A pulley cracked, one of the machine shafts bent. Foreman Alan Marsh had to travel to farm number 2 for a replacement pulley. Hours passed. 4 in the afternoon arrived. The repair was finally complete. 10 loaded bundle wagons were waiting. The crew stood in line. The boiler held full pressure. There was just one problem: the water level had dropped to a dangerous point. Steam boilers in this era required a precise balance. The rule, in its simplest form, do not run the machine without sufficient water in the boiler. Why? Because without water, concentrated steam drives pressure far beyond what the pipes can hold. That pressure searches the metal for a weakness, a single rivet, a thin line of corrosion, a hairline crack. When it finds one, it tears through. Now here's the detail about this machine that almost nobody mentions. Ernsberger was waiting for the water wagon. His profession demanded it. But Marsh could not wait. 10 idle wagons, a stalled crew, a season slipping away. It all pressed down on him at once. Marsh turned to Ernsberger. The sources record this conversation in a single sentence. He told him not to wait for the water wagon. He ordered him to start right now. And this is the turning point of the story. We don't know what Ernsberger was thinking in that moment. Maybe he looked around. Maybe he looked but didn't see. He started the machine. Not at the moment of the explosion. I want to stop here, because inside this story there is a detail that most accounts miss entirely. Before the season began, this engine had been taken into town. Maintenance had been performed. New flues had been installed. Engineers had examined it and declared it ready. There was no known defect in the boiler. That matters. Because the first assumption most people make when they hear about a boiler explosion is old machine, neglected boiler, worn-out equipment. No, that isn't what happened here. So why did it explode? In North Dakota in 1891, there was no official boiler inspection law. There was no state inspector. There was no independent engineering authority. No one with any legal standing to stand between an impatient foreman and an unsafe command. Saying, "We performed maintenance," was enough, regardless of who did it or how carefully. The engineer's knowledge, his professional instinct, none of it counted when there was no legal framework standing behind him. The heaviest thing I learned while researching this, the North Dakota legislature debated a boiler inspection bill in 1899. They rejected it. If you were Ernsberger, standing at that machine with that order, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where people land on this. The Boiler Inspection Bill Killed. That's the headline in the Bismarck Weekly Tribune, March 3, 1899. Count how many years after this disaster that was. 8 years. 8 years of the same explosions. 8 years after the Grandin Farm disaster, after the 1889 explosions where roughly 50 threshing crew members had died, after 1895's wave of new deaths across the state. The law did not pass, not in 1899. Why didn't it? Inspection meant cost. Cost meant lower profit. And the people who owned this land ran their affairs from Pennsylvania and other states far away. They were the ones who stood to lose from an inspection law. The explosion happened around 4 o'clock. Nate Osman, the head feeder, was at the toolbox between the engine and the threshing machine at that moment. He was on his knees, searching for a tool. Then all at once, everything filled with steam. Osman, in his own account, said, "Iron was flying past me. I ran behind the threshing machine. When I realized the danger was over, I went back and called out to the men to help the injured." When Osman came back, there were very few men left to help the injured. Remember that question from the opening. Why did Ernsberger start the engine, knowing the danger? Here is where the answer lives. Not in the machine. In what happened next. Alan Marsh's head was found 30 meters from his body. The explosion was that powerful. Engineer M.N. Ernsberger was found with his head blown open. The man who gave the order and the man who followed it, gone in the same instant. Fireman Hans Brosted lay next to the firebox, his throat cut. A W. Blowers was dead. J. M. Burns was dead. William Clark was dead. 6 dead. 2 badly injured. 6 names that don't appear in any history textbook. A saddle horse had been tied to the rear wheel of the engine. The explosion threw the saddle into the air. The horse was not hurt. That detail, the unharmed horse, the 6 dead men, was talked about in that region for years. The debris stayed in the field. Nobody went near it. Weeds grew over it. Farmers went around it. Farm equipment for years quietly steered around that spot. The only monument to 6 men was the ground that would not grow anything useful. It passed into local memory as cursed ground, a patch of earth where only weeds grew, never plowed, never touched. No lawsuit was filed, no court record survived, no official inquiry. The farm continued operating the following season. Alan Marsh left behind a young wife and 2 small children. The Grandin brothers issued no formal statement from Pennsylvania, at least none that made it into the record. The families of the other 5 men remain unnamed in every account I found. The Grand Forks Daily Herald reported the explosion on November 4, 1891. A few weeks later, on December 4, 1891, the same paper published a commentary titled "Risky Business." But these were only news articles. Nothing changed. In 1895, dozens of new explosions occurred across North Dakota. The pattern was always the same. Water too low, season too late, foreman too impatient. There's one more piece of this story most accounts skip entirely. I'll get to it in a moment. In 1899, the inspection law was rejected by a legislature that had watched 8 years of dead threshing crews. And 1891 was in fact one of the last great seasons of the Grandin Empire. Prices had fallen. Yields had declined. The great era of Bonanza farming was closing. The system that had brought 800 men into those fields every fall, that had run machines until dark in October, that counted days in profit and men in expenditures, that system was done. In 1915, the Grand Forks newspaper ran this headline: "Grandin Farm changes hands." Parcels were sold off one by one. Small family farms replaced the divisions. The last piece of Grandin family land was sold in 1948. The empire was gone. The men had been gone for a long time. The North Dakota legislature finally acted in 1907, 16 years after the Grandin disaster. Legal safety regulations for steam engines came into effect for the first time that year. It took more Ernsbergers, more Marshes, more Osmonds, more survivors to make it happen. 16 years of the same boilers running short of water. 16 years before the law caught up. The wreckage waited in that field for years. Weeds grew around it. Farmers avoided passing that way. The pile of debris left from this disaster was regarded as an accursed spot on the ground, and it grew up in weeds and was never cultivated. I keep thinking about Ernsberger's hesitation in that moment. There was no water. It was dangerous. He knew that. He could have foreseen how it would end. There's a version of that afternoon where he says no and walks away. But around him were 10 loaded wagons, idle men standing there. The season was closing, and a foreman gave an order, regardless of who he was, regardless of how he said it. The system had already decided for him. Ernsberger started the machine. It was not a mistake in the way we usually mean that word. It was a dead end, the last available move inside a system that had taken every other option away from him. Now let's return to the question from the opening. The engine had just been overhauled. The rule was known. Every man on that crew knew what the rule was. Why did 6 men die? Because knowing the rule is not enough. You have to be in a position to apply it. Ernsberger knew what was right, but he had nothing to stand behind when it mattered. No legal protection, no independent inspection, no mechanism that shielded him. Marsh made a fatal error that day, but the system allowed him to make it. The system rewarded impatience and punished caution. And then, when it was over, it moved on to the next harvest, on the next farm, with the next crew. The cursed ground grew thick. For years, nobody touched that earth. Not the next season, not the one after. The weeds had it. And the community around it understood something the legislature did not. That ground was owed something. These stories deserve to be heard. If you think so too, a like and a subscribe keeps this channel going. It genuinely matters. Drop a comment and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I'm always curious where this reaches, and if there's something you think I missed or got wrong, tell me. I read every comment and I take them seriously. Because these names, Ernsberger, Brosted, Blowers, Burns, Clark, they deserve to be gotten right. The Grandin empire is gone. The Bonanza farms are gone. The steam engines are in museums. But on some farms in the Red River Valley, people still know which field has the patch that never gets plowed. They don't always know why. Ernsberger started the machine because the system he worked inside had stripped away every other choice. That's not an excuse for what happened on October 21st, 1891. It's a warning about what happens when the only person standing between a bad order and a broken boiler is the man who gets killed by both.